A Christian grandmother answered the phone and heard her grandson crying for help. He knew what to call her, sounded terrified, and begged her not to tell anyone. Margaret was seconds away from sending her life savings when something on the table made her stop. What she didn't know was that this wasn't Joshua. It was an AI voice scam, and the fake emergency call had been designed to sound real enough to defeat both her reason and her faith. But the criminals made one mistake. They underestimated biblical discernment. An old Bible, a forgotten sentence written by Joshua as a child, and one unexpected decision would expose the elder scam before it was too late. Yet, what happened next was even more powerful, because the false voice didn't just reveal a crime. It awakened a young man who had been running from God for years. At 76, Margaret Wilson had learned that ordinary afternoons could carry sacred moments, though most of them arrived disguised as routine. That Tuesday, the Christian grandmother sat near her kitchen window, folding towels while an old gospel hymn played softly from the radio. Her tea had already gone cold, a familiar little tragedy she often joked was simply part of being a grandmother. Then the telephone rang, and when she answered, a trembling young voice whispered, "Nana, please don't tell Mom. I'm in trouble." Margaret froze because the voice didn't merely sound similar to Joshua's. It carried his rhythm, his pauses, and the tender way he always said, "Nana." For a moment, she forgot about online warnings, complicated technology, and every story she had ever heard about an AI voice scam. This didn't sound like a machine, a stranger, or a suspicious recording. It sounded like the boy she had rocked to sleep during thunderstorms. The caller breathed heavily, as though he were trying not to cry, and Margaret could almost picture Joshua sitting somewhere cold and frightened. That is what makes a fake emergency call so powerful. It doesn't begin by attacking someone's intelligence. It begins by touching someone's love. And when love is suddenly mixed with fear, even a wise person may feel as though there is no time to stop, think, pray, or ask questions. Margaret pressed the phone closer to her ear and asked, "Joshua, honey, where are you? What happened?" The voice hesitated, then explained that there had been an accident and that everything had become terribly complicated. Each detail arrived carefully wrapped in urgency, just enough to sound believable, but never clear enough to be independently confirmed. An elder scam often works that way, offering emotion instead of evidence and pressure instead of patience. Still, Margaret wasn't thinking like someone studying a scam. She was thinking like a grandmother who believed her grandson needed her immediately. People often imagine biblical discernment as a calm decision made with an open Bible, perfect lighting, and plenty of time to reflect. But real discernment is usually tested when the heart is racing, the facts are incomplete, and someone is demanding an answer right now. The voice on the line sounded wounded, embarrassed, and afraid. The exact combination most likely to awaken Margaret's protective instincts. Then the caller lowered his voice and repeated, "Please, Nana, you're the only person I can trust, but you can't tell anyone." And with that single request for secrecy, the peaceful afternoon began turning into something Margaret had never expected to face. The caller told Margaret that Joshua had been involved in an accident and could face serious legal trouble unless an attorney was paid immediately. He spoke in broken sentences, pausing just long enough to make the fear feel real, then rushing ahead before she could think clearly. That is how a fake emergency call often works. It gives the heart no room to breathe, and the mind no time to verify. Margaret's hands began to shake, and the Christian grandmother felt a wave of panic stronger than anything she had expected. In that moment, fear wasn't merely knocking at the door of her faith. It was trying to sit in the driver's seat. The false Joshua begged her not to contact his mother, claiming she would become angry and make everything worse. He said the lawyer needed money within the hour, and if she delayed, Joshua might spend the night in jail. An AI voice scam becomes especially dangerous when it combines urgency, secrecy, and emotional guilt in the same conversation. Margaret imagined her grandson alone, frightened and ashamed, and every loving instinct inside her told her to rescue him. The cruel brilliance of an elder's scam is that it turns compassion into a weapon without the victim realizing it. Margaret walked toward her bedroom, where she kept her banking information inside a small wooden drawer. She had spent years saving that money carefully, saying no to unnecessary purchases and choosing simple living over comfort. Yet now, she was prepared to send nearly everything, because love can make sacrifice feel natural when someone appears to be suffering. This is why biblical discernment must include practical habits. Pause the conversation, call a trusted relative, and verify the story through a second source. But Margaret wasn't thinking about a safety checklist. She was hearing the voice of the child she had prayed for since the day he was born. The caller remained on the line while she opened her banking app and struggled to enter the numbers correctly. He kept saying, "Hurry, Nana," with just enough tenderness to sound like Joshua and just enough pressure to keep her afraid. For one painful moment, Margaret believed that slowing down would make her responsible for whatever happened next. Fear often tells believers that immediate action is the same as faithful action, even when wisdom is quietly asking them to wait. Then, as she lifted her eyes from the screen, something familiar on the table interrupted the panic before she pressed confirm. Margaret's eyes landed on a worn Bible resting beside the lamp, its faded blue cover softened by years of small hands and Sunday lessons. It had belonged to Joshua when he was a child, back when he asked big questions with the confidence only children seem to have. The Christian grandmother had placed it there days earlier, intending to dust it and return it to the family shelf. Now, in the middle of a fake emergency call, that forgotten Bible seemed to stand out more clearly than the glowing banking screen. Sometimes God's guidance doesn't arrive with thunder. Sometimes it waits quietly on a table until fear finally looks up. Margaret reached for the Bible while the caller kept pressing her to hurry, clearly afraid that even a few seconds might break the spell. Her fingers opened almost instinctively to John 10, and her eyes stopped at the words, "My sheep hear my voice." The verse didn't magically explain the AI voice scam, but it reminded her that not every familiar voice deserves immediate obedience. Biblical discernment often begins with a simple question: does this voice lead toward truth, peace, and light, or toward panic, secrecy, and confusion? That question can protect a believer in many situations, whether the pressure comes through a phone call, a relationship, or a rushed financial decision. Then Margaret noticed a sentence written in uneven pencil beneath the verse, surrounded by the shaky lines of a child's handwriting. "Jesus' voice never makes us panic away from truth," Joshua had written during a Sunday school lesson many years before. The words were simple, almost innocent, yet they cut through the elder scam with more power than any technical warning she had ever heard. She remembered helping him spell the word panic, laughing when he accidentally wrote it twice and blamed the pencil for being nervous. That tiny memory brought warmth to the room, but it also made the voice on the phone suddenly feel colder and less trustworthy. The caller repeated that the lawyer was waiting and warned that everything would become worse if Margaret contacted anyone else. Yet the Bible in her hands was exposing the pattern. Fear demanded speed, deception demanded secrecy, and truth welcomed examination. A wise person learns to notice those signs, perhaps by writing down family numbers, creating a private verification question, or praying before transferring money. Margaret was still trembling, but now her fear was no longer giving orders. It was being questioned by the truth she had nearly forgotten. And as the false Joshua begged her not to hang up, Margaret realized she had one choice left that would reveal which voice she was truly hearing. Margaret drew a slow breath and told the caller, "Joshua, stay calm. I need to check something before I do anything." The voice immediately changed, not in sound, but in pressure, insisting that one call to the family would ruin everything. That reaction told her more than the story itself, because truth may be uncomfortable, but it rarely fears honest verification. With the Bible still open beside her, The Christian grandmother ended the fake emergency call despite the caller's desperate protests. Her finger hovered over the screen for a second, and then she called Joshua's mother directly. When her daughter answered with a relaxed voice, Margaret asked the question as carefully as she could. "Where is Joshua right now?" There was a brief silence, followed by confusion, and then the answer came. Joshua was safe, at work, and had not been in any accident. Margaret sat down so quickly that the chair scraped across the kitchen floor, a small sound that somehow made the room feel real again. The AI voice scam had copied Joshua's tone, his tenderness, and even his nervous breathing, but it could not survive a simple second call. That is why biblical discernment is not suspicion toward everyone. It is the wisdom to test what demands immediate trust. Margaret explained the entire conversation, including the request for secrecy, the supposed attorney, and the urgent demand for money. Her daughter quickly contacted Joshua, while Margaret wrote down the phone number and saved every detail she could remember. Practical wisdom matters in an elder scam. Call the real family member, contact the bank, report the number, and never send money under pressure. She also changed her banking passwords and asked the bank to place extra verification on large transfers. Faith had not made her passive. It had given her enough courage to slow down and act wisely. Minutes later, Joshua called her, and the real voice sounded less polished, more confused, and deeply concerned. "Nana, I'm fine," he said, and Margaret closed her eyes as relief washed over her like rain after a long, dry season. Yet beneath that relief was a new question neither of them could ignore. How had strangers learned enough about Joshua to sound so convincing? The fake emergency call had failed, but the wound it opened was larger than money because it touched trust, distance, and family silence. And when Joshua heard exactly what his stolen voice had said, something inside him began to break. Joshua listened in silence while Margaret repeated the words spoken during the fake emergency call. Hearing his own phrases described back to him felt unsettling, almost as though a stranger had entered his life, wearing his face. The AI voice scam had not simply copied sound. It had stolen trust built over years of birthdays, prayers, and family memories. Joshua tried to make a joke about technology getting way too smart, but the humor faded before the sentence was finished. For the first time, he understood that an elder scam could wound a family even when no money was lost. He began searching through old videos and public posts, wondering where the criminals might have collected enough audio to imitate him. There were birthday clips, short social media videos, voice messages, and even a recording from a church event years earlier. A few scattered seconds of speech had apparently been enough to create a voice his Christian grandmother nearly trusted completely. That realization carried a practical warning. Families should limit public voice recordings, tighten privacy settings, and agree on a private emergency phrase. Still, Joshua knew the deepest problem wasn't hidden inside a phone setting or a banking app. Margaret had tried calling him several times during the previous months, but Joshua had often answered late or not at all. He was busy, tired, distracted, and always promising himself that he would reconnect when life slowed down. Now he realized that his distance had created an empty space where a false voice could enter and sound more present than the real one. Biblical discernment becomes harder when relationships are neglected, because deception often grows where honest communication has become rare. Joshua felt ashamed that criminals had spoken to Margaret with urgency, while he had treated her love as something that could always wait. He apologized, but Margaret didn't shame him or use the moment to deliver a long sermon disguised as a conversation. She simply said, "The voice sounded like you, Joshua, but it didn't carry the truth I used to hear in you." That sentence stayed with him because it reached beyond the AI voice scam and touched something he had been avoiding for years. The real danger was no longer only that someone had copied his voice, it was that he barely recognized the direction of his own life. Then Margaret reached toward the old Bible still lying open on the table and quietly asked if he remembered writing inside it. Margaret placed the old Bible in Joshua's hands, and for a moment he held it as if it belonged to someone he used to know. The cover was worn, the corners were bent, and several pages carried the faint marks of childhood fingerprints. His Christian grandmother watched quietly while he turned to John 10 and found the sentence written beneath the verse. Jesus' voice never makes us panic away from truth, he read aloud, and the room seemed to grow still around him. The same words that had exposed the AI voice scam were now exposing the distance inside his own heart. Joshua remembered writing that sentence in Sunday school after his teacher explained how sheep learned to recognize the shepherd's voice. Back then, faith had felt simple. Pray honestly, tell the truth, forgive quickly, and run toward Jesus when life became frightening. But adulthood had filled his days with deadlines, entertainment, excuses, and the quiet habit of postponing everything spiritual. Biblical discernment had slowly become unfamiliar to him, not because God had stopped speaking, but because Joshua had stopped listening carefully. And now, strangely enough, a fake emergency call had forced him to face an emergency in his own soul. He realized that false voices do not always come through criminals, recordings, or an elder scam targeting someone vulnerable. Sometimes they sound like, "You're too busy to pray," "You can return to God later," or "Your family already knows you love them." Those thoughts rarely arrive shouting. They usually whisper until neglect begins to feel normal and distance begins to feel harmless. A person can test such voices by comparing them with Scripture, praying before reacting, and speaking with mature believers who value truth over comfort. Joshua could protect his grandmother with passwords and emergency codes, but no security measure could replace a heart trained to recognize Christ. Margaret didn't accuse him, because wisdom knows that conviction opens a door, while condemnation often makes people hide behind it. She reminded him that the Good Shepherd does not call wandering sheep merely to embarrass them. He calls because he intends to bring them home. Joshua lowered his head and admitted that he had missed church, avoided prayer, and ignored the people who tried to draw him back to faith. The stolen voice had nearly taken Margaret's savings, but his own silence had been stealing moments, relationships, and spiritual clarity for years. Then Margaret sat beside him and asked a question that would require more than an apology. "Which voice will you follow from now on?" In the days that followed, Margaret and Joshua gathered the family around the kitchen table and spoke honestly about what had happened. They created a private emergency phrase, saved important numbers, reviewed privacy settings, and agreed never to send money during a pressured call. Joshua explained how an AI voice scam could imitate someone familiar, while Margaret described how the fake emergency call had manipulated her emotions. Their plan was simple enough for everyone to remember: hang up, verify directly, involve another relative, and pray before making any urgent decision. Even the Christian grandmother joked that from then on, any grandson asking for money would first have to answer a family question only the real Joshua knew. Yet the family understood that protection required more than passwords, bank alerts, and warnings about an elder scam. Biblical discernment meant learning to recognize the pattern behind every voice that tried to control them. False voices rushed them, isolated them, demanded secrecy, and made fear seem more trustworthy than truth. The voice of Christ could correct them firmly, but it never needed deception to lead them toward obedience. That distinction became a lesson they began applying not only to phone calls, but also to relationships, decisions, temptations, and private thoughts. Joshua started visiting Margaret more often, and their conversation slowly moved from technology back to Scripture. He returned to church, joined a small Bible group, and began reading the Gospel of John one chapter at a time instead of making impossible promises. Margaret encouraged him to begin with practical habits: 10 minutes of prayer in the morning, one honest conversation each week, and one verse carried into the day. Real spiritual change rarely begins with dramatic speeches. More often, it begins with small acts of obedience, repeated when no one is watching. The young man who had once ignored his grandmother's calls was now learning that God's voice often reaches people through faithful relationships. Margaret also changed, because she no longer viewed the AI voice scam only as a frightening story she had narrowly survived. She began warning other older believers without embarrassing them, reminding them that wisdom is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to obey it blindly. At church, she shared how a worn childhood Bible had helped her stop a fake emergency call before panic emptied her savings. Joshua sat nearby, realizing that criminals had used his voice for harm, yet God had used the same moment to call him back to truth. And as the family listened, one question remained quietly in the room. How many people were following a convincing voice without first asking where it was leading them? Margaret's story is a warning, but it is also an invitation. An AI voice scam may copy a familiar sound, and a fake emergency call may use fear, urgency, and secrecy. But biblical discernment teaches believers to pause, pray, verify, and test every voice before following it. Whether someone is facing an elder scam, a rushed decision, or a spiritual temptation, the question remains the same. Does this voice lead toward truth, peace, and light, or does it push toward panic, isolation, and confusion? So, what voice has been guiding your decisions lately? Have fear, pressure, or distraction been speaking louder than Christ? And would your family know what to do if a convincing voice called them today? Create a private emergency phrase, check on the people you love, and return to Scripture before a crisis forces you to remember what matters most. If this story of a Christian grandmother touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to the channel, and activate notifications so you can continue learning through stories that strengthen faith, wisdom, and the courage to follow Jesus.